This is the Pentonomics program.
And welcome back to the second edition of the Pentonomics program. Today we have a very special guest, Jeff Deist. He is the president of the Mises Institute. He's a former advisor to Ron Paul and a tax attorney. Thank you so much for coming on the show today, Jeff.
Okay, great. Thanks for having me, Michael.
So let's start out from the beginning and talk a little bit about the Mises Institute. For those who are not familiar with what it's all about, tell us a little about the Mises Institute and what exactly is Austrian economics?
Well, Austrian economics is a loose term of convenience to describe a particular viewpoint that originated with economists who happen to hail from Austria. It became part of the mainstream viewpoint in the late 1800s and really up until Keynes and his revolution in the 1930s. But if I had to describe it very briefly, I would say it's a different way of looking at economics based on a strictly individual methodology of understanding economics in terms of human action and human volition. It's a different way of looking at money. It's a different way of looking at how economic decisions are made, how economic calculation takes place among entrepreneurs. And more than anything, it's a way of looking at economics as it really occurs rather than mathematically. Economics isn't a physical science. It's a social science, which means it involves human beings doing what they do. It's not like physics or chemistry or math. So
if I ask Janet Yellen on the Fed, doesn't she have a model to tell us exactly where the interest rate should be? So it's a little counterintuitive completely to what Austrians believe and what Keynesians believe. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Well, it is. I don't believe economics is a science where you create hypotheses and test them using empirical data. I think economics is a social science, and we can understand it using certain truisms about human beings and human nature. So I think that economics as a science has gone down a rabbit hole of mathematical modeling and statistics, which is a very different kind of science than economics was 50 or 100 years ago.
Oh, how true. So let's start. We've had an attack on this country for the past 8 years. Actually, in my opinion, it's been going on really since 1971. A complete and utter attack on freedom, personal freedom, and most importantly, economic freedom. So let's start with this election, the election of Mr. Donald Trump. Is Donald Trump an Austrian? Is he a Keynesian? And will he be able to return this country to some semblance of personal freedom and economic freedom?
Well, I don't think he's either. I don't think Donald Trump is necessarily well-read or well-versed in economics. I think he's a guy who's always been a pragmatist and a self-interested businessman. So I'm not particularly sure that he's philosophically or ideologically interested in Austrian theory or Keynesian theory. I think he's probably, like most politicians and like most people, a mishmash of ideas. And there's no crime in that. We're not all economists. I'm not an economist. And he's, certainly someone who's had success in business. So presumably he has at least some understanding that regulations and taxes don't help, but they hurt. I don't think this is a doctrinaire guy, and that's, of course, what makes him so dangerous. He said some good things about the Fed. He said some good things about interest rates. He said some good things about Janet Yellen and Ben Bernanke. Whether he follows through on any of these remains to be seen.
He also said he's the king of debt, and he loves a weak dollar. So he equivocates quite a lot, Jeff.
Well, he's in the real estate business, which means he wants both interest rates and dollars to be cheap, right? It's easier to sell real estate when the cost of borrowing money is cheap. So the entire housing industry, much like the auto industry, is absolutely benefits from low interest rates. I mean, the idea that it's, these policies aren't necessarily destructive to everyone across the board. We know they're destructive, but sure, there's people who benefit, and he's been one of them. So it's good that he acknowledges this and understands this. I would say that in itself is a good sign.
So let's talk a little bit about his plan. So he wants to reduce regulations. He wants to repatriate overseas earnings, and he wants to simplify the tax code. I want you to talk a little bit about that. But he also wants to increase fiscal deficits, and he wants to start a trade war with China. Let's talk about his tax code. So he wants to reduce tax rates, give us 3 tax rates basically, but he also wants to eliminate deductions. So are we going to get an effective change in the tax rate? Do you believe that's what's going to occur under a Trump administration?
From an economic perspective, the way to look at taxes is in total, in sum, how much money do they suck out of the legitimate private economy?
Amen.
Right?
Amen to that.
Beyond that, it becomes just a political fight over who pays. In other words, various special interest groups all vying to make sure they get a deduction or a tax credit. Individuals, of course, want the lowest marginal rate. So because of the complexity and confusion involved, both technically in the code, but also politically, I think Lou Rockwell laid out a good way to look at any tax reform proposal. Does it reduce or eliminate an existing tax? Mm-hmm. Anything beyond that, any complication, any reworking, any so-called reform beyond that, generally has political winners and losers. And I think libertarians should be very careful about supporting it. Let's just reduce or eliminate existing taxes and keep it simple, so we know the effects are always beneficial when we do that, because it leaves more money in the private economy where people either spend, save, or invest it. All 3 of which do far more good than sending it to Washington.
Right.
But so complexity is the enemy here. Complexity is the devil. And I'm not interested in starry-eyed reform proposals. I'm interested in reducing or eliminating taxes.
Okay, listen. The Pentonomics program believes that the lower the tax rate, the better. The more money you leave in the hands of the public, the private sector, and out of the public sector, the better off you'll be. I mean, we both agree on that. But what about eliminate deductions? Does the Mises Institute believe that all deductions should be eliminated? Does that include charitable giving? Does that include the interest on real estate? Where do you draw the line?
Well, I want all deductions to be expanded infinitely. The idea that libertarians should support an elimination of complexity, I understand it. I get it. And there are, of course, huge compliance burdens imposed on the economy, not just by paying taxes, but by filling out the forms and paying accountants and lawyers, especially in a corporate context, to deal with all the complexity. So I get the argument that says, well, if we really streamlined or reduced some deductions, eliminated some deductions, we'd have a much simpler and fairer tax code. But I'll tell you what, after working in Ron Paul's office for a few years, I'm really suspicious of that argument. I think that exceptions will creep in. I think special interests in certain industries will find ways to skew things their way. And I'm just not a believer in the idea that Congress can coherently create anything better politically. I think it's a fool's game for libertarians to get swept up in this.
Okay, great. So let's switch a little bit to talk about the deficit a little bit. We have a $20 trillion national debt. I think the publicly traded debt is around $15 trillion. The deficit is absolutely soaring. We're up 34% year over year from fiscal 2015, 2016. I just looked yesterday because we had the data that came out for the first 2 months of fiscal 2017. Deficit's already up 10%. I think it was $220 billion in red ink just in 2017 already for 2 months. And that's before we factor into any kind of infrastructure spending or rebuilding the defense, as both Donald Trump wants to do and Congress wants to do that. Okay, so there seems to be a complete green light on defense spending and infrastructure spending. So I did some work on the deficit, and if you count the increase in the interest on the debt and infrastructure and defense, we go to around $1.2 trillion in fiscal 2017 if he gets his druthers in the first 100 days. I mean, we're talking about spending cut. We're talking about tax cuts, and we talk about everything else that we just mentioned. But then if you have a recession in 2017, the deficit jumps to over $2 trillion. Don't forget, back in 2009, the deficit went from $200 billion in 2008 to 1.4 trillion in 2009. And we're way overdue for a recession. So basically my question is this: how much room do we have left in this country to leverage up the balance sheet and to do a Keynesian style fiscal spending package? Is there any room left in this nation? And how does that abrogate the position of freedom for Americans if we're piling on debt to our children and our grandchildren?
Well, I don't think we have much room left, but we have to understand that the economics mainstream, so-called in this country, absolutely believes. Let's understand this. Paul Krugman believes that the debt doesn't matter. He's talking about, Hillary, had she won, should open the floodgates of deficit spending to stimulate the economy. So we have to understand that what we're fighting against is literally a mindset in the popular profession of economics that the debt doesn't matter. Of course, you and I know that the debt does matter, but it matters in the most fundamental way long term in terms of its impact on the dollar. And like most of us, unless you happen to be fantastically wealthy and you're diversified in your wealth internationally, most of us have our savings and investments and income priced in U.S. dollars. So we care very much about the value and buying power of those dollars. So ultimately,
I'm sorry, I want to interject because this is very important. It's so important. The value of the dollar, and this is my own philosophical theory, the value of the dollar intrinsically can be falling. But if you compare the dollar, the currencies are paired. They're paired against the euro, they're paired against the Japanese yen. So couldn't it be that the dollar is rising in value against what Mr. Draghi is at the head of the ECB is doing over in Europe? Or I call him Hiroshima Kuroda, but it's Hirokio Kuroda, is doing at the Bank of Japan. Isn't it true that the dollar could rise in value versus these currencies, yet still lose intrinsically? In other words, real interest rates are falling in the United States, and then the dollar will be losing its value against hard assets. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, currencies are relative, and the U.S. dollar remains the least bad currency choice for most of the world in terms of stability and usability in worldwide markets. There's no question that these two things can happen concurrently, and it is happening concurrently. I mean, look, this can go on a long time, and it has. The fact that the dollar is strong against the euro and other currencies can continue, and none of us should be fooled by this. At some point, the world is going to start responding to what it already knows is true but hasn't fully digested, which is the United States of America, or at least its federal government, will never, ever, ever get its fiscal house in order. We will never pay off the debt in anything other than nominal terms. We'll never pay it off in real terms.
So they're going to inflate away the debt. That's what you're saying.
They're absolutely going to do so. And so the rest of the world is going to have to decide at some point, we recognize this and we're not going to buy U.S. treasuries any longer, or if we do, we're only going to do so at, let's say, junk bond rates. And at that point, presumably the Fed will have to be a much broader and bigger buyer of last resort for U.S. debt to cover over annual deficits.
I'll tell you right now, China's already selling our debt. They have to sell their debt to support their renminbi.
No question. It's a game of musical chairs. Nobody wants to be the first to start a big dollar sell-off because that will reduce the value of their dollar holdings. But nobody wants to be the last guy either, stuck with a bunch of dollars. So it's going to be it's going to be an interesting 10 or 20 years because it is clearly not in the rest of the world's interest
10 or 20.
To have the U.S. Well, whose interest is it in?
I think it's happening right now. If let's just say, because Donald Trump, I think he's I hate to say this, Jeff, but I think he's a little bit over his head. Do you think he really understands what will happen if interest rates normalize? My work shows that if the 10-year note, and by the way, the average going back to before Nixon closed the gold window in 71, the average interest rate on the 10-year note was 7.3%. Now, if interest rates go back anywhere near that, so with the average interest rate that we pay on our outstanding debt anywhere approaches 7%, there's more than $1 trillion right there just on interest in the debt. Does he really understand that we cannot normalize interest rates in the United States of America? Does he understand that? Does Janet Yellen understand that? Does Mr. Fisher, the vice chair, understand that? Do these individuals understand that if interest rates just normalize, and I can make a very cogent argument why they should be much higher than where they were back in the, from 1971 to 2006, 2007. Do they understand that if interest rates normalize, this whole house of cards comes crashing down?
Well, Fisher understands that. Yellen understands that. I'm not sure Trump does. Right now, interest on the debt is only about $225 billion in the federal government's annual budget. As you mentioned, if that went to $1 trillion, and then we're also spending $1 trillion a year on Social Security, Medicare, and defense, respectively, then it really becomes a matter of game over. So they're stuck. Donald Trump is stuck. The administration's stuck. If they don't raise interest rates, we can never get back to any semblance of a normal economy based on capital accumulation and savings. If they do raise interest rates, the federal government's deficit, the federal government's interest payments quickly become unworkable. So I wouldn't want to be president, and in a certain sense, from a libertarian perspective, it might have been better to have Hillary win and let her inherit what's going to come.
Wow. So liberty has to incorporate economic freedom. And, Mises Institute is all about liberty. Pentonomics program is developed to try to promulgate and spread liberty throughout this land. But liberty must incorporate economic freedom. And the foundation of economic freedom is sound money. And a free market principle, the foundation of sound money, is to have interest rates be free floating, a free market interest rate. If you don't have that, that's the cornerstone, the building block of economic freedom. What is the Mises Institute recommendation for returning to America to a free floating interest rate? Do they advocate a gold standard so we can keep the monetary base in check? What is the strategy that you promote over there at the Mises Institute?
Certainly, we would want money to be denationalized and made private, and then interest rates would take care of themselves. A gold standard, as you mentioned, doesn't need to be imposed. It's something that would arise naturally in a free market for money because gold has always been used as money and holds its value. And I think other kinds of money would arise as well and compete with it, including cryptocurrencies. So we don't need to impose any kind of money on the marketplace. The marketplace could take care of that quite nicely. And we could frankly even do so in a parallel system. Let the Fed continue to exist. Let the Fed continue to print dollars. If those dollars are really so great, the marketplace will decide that. But in the meantime, allow, which is to say legalize, a parallel system where people can use other forms of money for exchange and not be penalized with capital gains treatment by the IRS. So let people use gold, let people use Bitcoin, let people use silver, let people use e-gold and e-silver. And just allow this to happen.
Could they pay their taxes with those currencies?
They would. That's the only way it would work. You have to stop putting people in jail for trying to use other things than greenbacks, like Bernard von Nothaus, and legalize competing currencies. Is a very simple way to go about allowing people to diversify themselves out of this hellish situation the dollar's in without having to, eliminate the Fed, which I certainly advocate, but as a political matter. I think that the number one thing is to get people to understand money better, because as long as we're locked into this idea that money is a magical, mystical fiat issuance from central banks in their quasi government role, we're in deep trouble, because nobody ever talks about the quality of the dollar. They'll talk about the quality of a Honda Accord they're considering buying, the good or service that they want to look at. They'll judge that. But how does Honda get to judge the quality of the dollar it's receiving in exchange for one of its Accords? Well, hopefully Honda is looking at the macroeconomic political landscape and pricing that in, because it seems to me that when you quadruple the monetary base, or more than quadruple the monetary base just since 2008, which is what the Fed has done with its balance sheet, that at some point that's going to exert some very ugly pressure on consumers and on the value of the dollar, and the value of what we all think is going to sustain us in our old age, our 401k, our house, our stocks, whatever it might be.
What could possibly go wrong, Jeff? I mean, they took the balance sheet from 800 billion to 4.5 trillion, took interest rates virtually zero and left them there for 8 years. I mean, we haven't had any experience in the past where they took interest rates to say like 1% from 2004 to 2000 and 2003 to 2004, and then raised them from 1 to 5.25. That didn't cause any harm. Oh yeah, well maybe it did. Blow up the housing bubble and the whole entire global economy. So maybe we do have a little experience. But I just want to say something about the gold standard. Why gold standard? You know, they call it, Keynes call it a barbarous relic. What I believe, Pentonomics believes, the importance of a gold standard is it limits the monetary base to pair with the growth in the labor force plus productivity. That's GDP. So those two components always have been and always will be equal to what GDP growth is. And they're always been around, the trend growth has always been around 2 to 3%. And mine supply of gold has usually been around 1.5 to 2%. So you get a slight deflation in the economy, which means your dollar gains its purchasing power, which is great for that savings investment dynamic. But you don't really have to go on a gold standard, but you have to behave as if the monetary base can never grow more than labor force growth plus productivity growth. That's the key. And that keeps asset bubbles in check, keeps interest rates stable, and keeps the currency stable, and supports the middle class. That's what's so important. And wouldn't you believe and agree that that's a building block of economic and personal liberty?
Well, absolutely. A stable dollar is the only way to have a stable society, or a stable currency, I should say. And look, I'm all for any kind of reined-in Fed, any kind of Fed that limits or slows monetary expansion. I'm all for. What I question when it comes to rules-based Fed proposals like the Taylor rule or other ideas, like Alan Greenspan himself famously said that the Fed can mimic gold in its open market committee operations and make the dollar operate like gold. I think that's all great if it was true or sustainable. But I just think the political pressures that surround the Fed, nobody wants to be president. Nobody wants to be a member of Congress or a senator when the economy is in a tailspin. I think the political pressures to use monetary expansion to paper over reality are just too strong, which is why I think as long as you have a central bank that has a monopoly over the issuance of a currency that's legally mandated for use in a society, I think you're always going to be susceptible to expansion, because it's always easier to expand the money supply than it is to cut spending or raise taxes. It's always easier.
Especially when you're running deficits that are approaching $1 trillion. Like it's supposed to go, the CBO estimates it'll be back to $1 trillion very shortly. So, I mean, if you're constrained by that monetary base, that gold standard, your interest rates will just spiral out of control. So, you're a very smart man, Jeff. Just leave us. I have 2 questions left, but we're wrapping it up here. What's the hope for this country?
Could you repeat that in case my wife is listening? I'd like to get that out there as more general knowledge.
Well, clearly our audience can tell you're an extremely bright man. What's the hope for this country? What's going to happen in the next 4 years and maybe even the next 8 years under Mr. Trump? Are we going to be able to return this country to freedom? Can we eradicate the asset bubbles that have been generated with impunity? That's the real question. Can we burst the bond bubble, the epic bond bubble? Can we, by the way, I haven't mentioned the housing market is back to all-time highs, much quicker than I ever thought possible. The shows are on TV about flipping homes again. The stock market's at a record high nearly every day. It's been setting a record high. I manage money for a living, so, I mean, that's my problem more than it is your problem, because honestly, I don't really believe that we could extricate ourselves from these asset bubbles that exist in stocks, bonds, and real estate. I can talk for a long time about the record valuations of the stock market, and they're pricing in absolute perfection under Donald Trump. Can we return this country to viable freedom, a viable course of prosperity without bursting those asset bubbles? And doesn't it mean if those asset bubbles burst, they're going to have some period of time, hopefully truncated in nature, but some period of time of adjustment where, yes, recessions and sometimes even depressions occur. They're natural, they're healthy, they're like earthquakes. They allow those tectonic plates to ease the pressure. And on the other side of that, we could have a real and genuine prosperous economy?
Well, I'm afraid the answer is no. The answer is we can't get back to a real economy unless and until we allow this asset bubble to deflate, and that means a painful recession or worse. It means what they used to talk about in the 20s rationally, which is you need bankruptcy, you need liquidation, you need maybe even something on the order of a debt jubilee, as talked about in biblical times. I mean, there's the world has more debt than it's ever going to be able to pay. It has far more debt, both the businesses, households, individuals, central governments, far more debt than existed in 2008. And they've done nothing but make it worse, they, meaning governments and central banks, since that time. So, at some point, you just have to wonder if a global reset isn't in order. The danger is that global reset takes the form of something under the auspices of the IMF or the God forbid, the UN, something akin to a Bretton Woods agreement where the G7 nations come together and say, well, gee whiz, we can't have these economic shocks and dislocations caused by central banks acting autonomously at odds with one another. So we need some sort of new global currency, a basket of currencies as represented by special drawing rights, SDRs, issued by the IMF. If you want to know about this stuff, read James Rickards. It publishes at Agora. He does fantastic work on understanding this. So we can go one of two ways. So we can have a big crash and revert back to national currencies, or we can have a big crash and revert to some kind of monster global currency and global control. I suspect those are the two choices. So when you look at it that way, perhaps libertarians should have a little bit better understanding of the choice between nationalism and globalism. We'd prefer individualism to nationalism, but if that's the choice, I'll take nationalism.
Sounds to me like there's unfortunately going to be some pain ahead. And it looks to me also like more and more freedoms are going to be abrogated before we get to that other side. I just want to also say quickly that if you look at what's going on in India and Venezuela, there's an intractable trend towards eliminating currencies, physical currencies, paper currencies, and that's a more and more of an incursion on your freedoms. If you have only digital currencies in existence, they can do anything they want. They can steal your money, they can track everything you buy and sell, and they could make interest rates as negative as they like, and there's nothing you can do. Before I wrap up, I just have one more question for you, and it's a little tongue-in-cheek. Is the Pentonomics program and the Mises Institute fake news? I'm a little bit concerned about that. Would you like to comment on fake news?
Well, no, we're not news. We're opinion and advocacy first and foremost. But unlike the news, we don't hide it. We're upfront about it. So all news is fake news in this sense. All news is filtered by the organization or individual journalist, and all news attempts to persuade rather than just inform. So there's no such thing as real news. What the only thing new is that we're all waking up to the fact that news is fake. So I think that's a good thing and a healthy thing. And I think the people who are howling about it are bad people, and that we should all be thankful this Christmas season that we've discovered a truth as a result of this awful 2016 election. The truth is that the media in this country and in the West is a sham, and that we're on our own. There's nobody looking out for us. We have to, cut through the cloud of information and get to knowledge. Information's easy, knowledge is not so easy. So it's on us as individuals, and we might as well just know that and be cognizant of it rather than deluding ourselves.
Well, my personal opinion is that a lot of cable news channels are fake news, but I'll leave it at that. My guest has been Jeff Deist, the president of the Mises Institute, holding the torch and the candle of freedom, and I'm so glad to have had him on our program. Thank you so much, Jeff.
Thank you, Michael. I loved it.